Good evening. I'd like to call the Tuesday, October 14th, 2014 meeting of Falls Church City Council to order. If you all please rise for the Pledge of Allegiance. Good evening. Madam Clerk, will you call the roll call, please?
Yes. Mr. Baruch? Ms. Conley?
Here.
Mr. Duncan?
Here.
Ms. Oliver?
Here.
Mr. Snyder?
Here.
Mr. Z?
Here.
Mayor Tarter?
Here. Do we have a motion to adopt the meeting agenda?
I'll make a motion to adopt the meeting agenda.
Second? Do we have a second? Second. Mr. Duncan on the second. All in favor? Aye. Opposed? Abstentions? Okay. Are there any proclamations, Madam Clerk, this evening?
No, sir.
Okay. Any oaths of office to new boards and commission members?
No, sir.
Okay. Okay, so why don't we move on to the receipt of public comments? Could you summarize the written comments, Madam Clerk?
There were a lot of comments this month. We had boards and commissions that submitted their comments for the Weston Broad project. That was from the Village Preservation and Improvement Society, the Citizens Advisory Committee on Transportation.
I don't know if you know, your microphone seems to be reverberating or something. I
don't know if I should go farther away or closer.
I don't know if anyone in the back can
How's
work
that?
on that. That's
Is that better? Okay,
Yeah.
I thought I heard that. The Architectural Advisory Board and CATCH. Is it just me? And we had 5 comments about the Weston Broad projects from citizens. Some of them were just forwarding their comments from the Planning Commission public hearing. You do have all of those in your packet. We had 5 comments about the possible closing of the DMV Select Office, and folks writing into requests that did not happen. We had 5 comments on the use of water sale proceeds, and some of them were also, they were folks that were at the town hall meeting and wanted to submit their comments so that you would have them. I had 3 comments on the Miller House RFP. A representative from the Fairfax Falls Church Community Service Board wrote in support, as well as the board itself. And we had one citizen who had a concern about the consistency of the group home with the North Washington Street Small Area Plan. We had 3 people who wrote to urge the council to take action to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and that's at the behest of the Council of Governments Air Quality and Climate Committees. Linda Neighborgall just had some questions about the Mount Daniel Bond referendum and how the budgeting and school expansions are handled. And then we had several comments from citizens about what are known as paper streets, and the Village Preservation and Improvement Society also wrote to you all about that.
Thank you. Now I'm going to open it up to members of the public who wish to address the City Council tonight, and I have two speaker slips from Victor Wong. Mr. Wong, you're welcome to come up now, or you can speak when the item is called.
I can speak when the items are called.
Yes, so in other words, if you'd like to speak out of the budget amendment, you can speak at the time that the budget amendment is heard, and the water proceeds fund as well. You can speak either now on both items, or you can speak when the items are called and heard by council. It's your choice. You'll wait? Yes. Okay, that's fine. Is there any other member of the public who wishes to address council at this time? You, again, will be welcome at the time the item is brought up as well to speak, but you're welcome to speak now. Okay, I don't hear any, so before we move on to council request, I would like to welcome our newest city attorney, Carol McCroskey. So Carol has got, I think it's 24 years experience with the Arlington County Attorney's Office, and doing everything from land use, rezoning, development work, real estate, school board, I think you've pretty much done it all in your tenure over there. So we're delighted to have you here with us today, UVA law graduate as well. So, but anyway, it's our pleasure to welcome you here to Falls Church, and again, welcome to the city. Okay, are there any council requests? Mr. Snyder?
Thank you very much, Mr. Mayor. Actually, a couple. First of all, I think the mayor and the chair of the school board may have received a request from the League of Women Voters on the funding the Mount Daniel project. So I think that is something that should make it into the written comments. Secondly, I wanted to address the citizens who have written regarding the climate change issue. I chaired a joint meeting with and I chair the Metropolitan Washington Air Quality Committee, which held a joint meeting with the Climate Energy COG group as well. During the course of the meeting, we had heard a number of presentations, and the region will focus again on all sources of air pollution to see how we can improve air quality, with a particular focus on transportation, and that issue will be moving forward, and expect to hear more about that. There is some good news. Our air quality is dramatically better than it was 20 years ago. For 2 straight years, which is the first time ever, we've had no code red days. So while there's very good news, there's more work that needs to be done. So I wanted to report back to our citizens that they have been heard, and we collectively agreed to move forward in a way which I think they would find helpful and constructive. And the second, well, I guess third matter I wanted to bring up was at the Council of Governments board meeting, the city received a great award, which we've talked about, and I'll let the mayor talk about that later. But I asked that the issue of Ebola preparedness be discussed at the level of the COG Board of Directors. We did hear from 2 public health experts. Frankly, listening to them and seeing events that have followed afterwards, I'm not nearly as certain, nor do I think they are as they were when they had originally presented to the COG Board. So I would ask at some point in the future if city management might provide information on our website, as well as information perhaps during a city council meeting or elsewhere on that particular topic, anything that people should be doing and that our region and our city in particular ought to be concerned with and doing. I do note that the subject came up yesterday during the senatorial debate, and both Ed Gillespie and Mark Warner commented about it and talked about the potential for travel restrictions. Nonetheless, I think it's an issue of current interest, important interest, and it I think deserves some further attention. So I would ask that there be a presentation in the future and information provided to our public in response to the growing concern. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Snyder. And the award that you are referring to was actually brought to the work session last week. I don't know if you all recall that or not, but the city received a Council of Government Energy Environmental Leadership Award, and that was for the fact that we had reached the EPA's Green Power Community level, which is 3%, and I think 3.2% of our entire community, that includes businesses, residents, et cetera, use green power, renewable power. The second part of that is a Green Power Partnership, EPA's Green Power Partnerships and partnership, and that requires an organization such as the city buy 5% of their power from renewable sources, which we do as well. So we're the first jurisdiction in Virginia, and the only jurisdiction in Virginia, to my knowledge, to meet those goals. And I think a lot of that actually is because of the work of Tim Stevens, who happens to be here coincidentally. Tim, would you mind standing up and just be recognized? So. Thank you. Mr. Duncan, did you have a comment as well?
Thanks, just one. Thanks to the staff for the town hall meeting on Saturday about the water sale proceeds. It was taped, and there were call-outs to it on the city's website and Facebook page. I hope that folks who were not able to attend would spend some time to watch it, and if they do, I just wanted the manager to make a little note. The beginning of the taped version has some, empty space at the outset. I think like 16 or 17 minutes. I think, the on button got pushed, and it took us a while to assemble. At any rate, anybody might get a little discouraged if they pushed play and didn't hear anything for that long. So maybe we could just fix that up. If it wasn't fixed today, last I checked, it was still that way. I think that'd be helpful for citizens who are interested in watching that program. Thanks.
Okay, Ms. Conley?
I have a couple of things. The other day, I had the pleasure of taking a tour of the Jesse Thackeray Preschool, and I thought I was going just to get an update on what the preschool construction was like. And what I discovered was this amazing stormwater management project that's going on in Falls Church. I had the camera to take pictures of classrooms, and I took lots of pictures of pipes and cisterns and dishes, and it's a really impressive stormwater management project and a very impressive partnership between the city and the schools that I think we need to highlight as many ways as possible, because I think it will be great benefit to the people in that neighborhood and a good way to show our stormwater dollars at work.
Thank you. Anyone else?
Oh, I have one more.
Okay.
And that is just about paper streets, Mr. Shields. There were some comments from Village Preservation and also some citizens, and I know there's been things on the Broadmont listserv about paper streets, and that comes up occasionally. I'm not quite clear on what the rules about paper streets are or how those things are determined. Is there a policy process? How does that all work? Does City Council have any say on the use of paper streets, or is that all staff?
The letter that we received from VPUS was a very thoughtful letter, and we are reviewing it, and we will get back with VPUS in writing to address the questions that they've raised. To vacate a public right-of-way does require city council action. The city owns its streets fee simple as land ownership, and so the council is in charge of disposing or determining how they will be used. With respect to the specific instances that were raised in the VPUS letter, we will provide a thorough written response on the details behind those. In those instances, those were not changes in policy, and so they did not require council action. But we can provide more detail on that, and we'll get that letter out this week.
Any other comments? Maybe we'll go ahead and now move to the report of the city manager. Mr. Shields?
Thank you, Mayor Tarter, members of council. Just a few things to report on. One, I've put at the council dais, and we've been working for months on this, but the Urban Land Institute will be hosting a technical assistance panel here in the city of Falls Church tomorrow, Wednesday, and Thursday, and we are very much looking forward to this group of experts in real estate and development and land use and economic development coming to the city to share their expertise in a 2-day intensive workout where we'll be talking about the Mary Ellen Henderson George Mason High School campus and its future use for economic development as well as for school uses. And so I just wanted to note that the presentation of their recommendations, which is scheduled for Thursday at 5 o'clock, will be at the Hilton Garden Inn. All of the public is welcome to that. Again, that's 5 o'clock on Thursday at the Hilton Garden Inn. Prior to that, there's more targeted outreach to stakeholders and for input into their planning process. But I think the majority of their time will just be that group of professionals coming together to do their work and to provide us with their best thinking and their best recommendations. So I want to thank Jim Snyder for his work in organizing this. Susan Bell, who's a contract worker for the city, has been our lead organizer for it, and the steering committee appointed by the City Council has overseen the planning effort for this technical assistance panel. So we're looking forward to that. When we do get the results, they will be shared publicly, and then they will inform some of our next steps in that planning effort for the campus. Secondly, I'd like to report on the Mason Row project. We did have a work session discussion with the City Council last Wednesday, and we are anticipating a resubmittal by Spectrum Development in late October. And in the meantime, we're using our time with them to just keep the lines of communication open In terms of the scheduling of the project, if we were to keep the project close on the schedule that we've discussed before, with this coming back to council in November, their resubmittal will need to be very thorough, and we'll need to address the concerns and issues that we've raised with them. And so we'll coordinate with them to try to make sure that stays on track. On a regional initiative, the mayor attended the Northern Virginia Regional Commission and brought back to us a program where the region is collecting blankets to be shipped to Turkey to be used by refugees from the Syrian conflict. This is a regional effort that occurred last year, and over 18,000 blankets were collected across the country and sent over to that war-torn area. The City of Falls Church will participate in this. It will kick off on November 1st, and at our next meeting of council, I'll have more details on exactly what we're, for people who would donate blankets, exactly where to drop them off and sort of what people can do to help. And Barbara Cram has been tapped by the mayor also to support that effort, and so it's a very worthwhile regional effort spearheaded by the Northern Virginia Regional Commission, and the city will play its part in that effort as well. Those are just a few items to report on. I'm happy to answer any questions.
If I could just add, well, go ahead, Ms. Conley.
My question is about the parking along Park Avenue. At a previous meeting, we talked about staff looking at that in conjunction with the Mason Road project moving along. Is there any report on where we are or what has to happen?
We've had some staff work on this, and I've also met personally with the neighbors, and so I understand very clearly what the neighbors on Park Avenue would like to see happen. We need to put that in the context of a couple other policy issues. One, this is something that this street would like. I'm pretty sure there are many streets in the city would like something similar to this. We want to describe some criteria by which the future councils can determine when a program like this would be appropriate. And we also have other stakeholders on the street that depend very much on on-street parking there currently. And just out of courtesy, we want to engage with them about that before we bring our recommendations to the council so that that doesn't come as a surprise to them. And so that's where that stands, and we've got some more work to do, but I think we have a very clear picture of what the neighborhood would like to have.
Mr. Baruch?
I just have a question regarding that issue, more from a policy perspective, not just dealing with the immediate Mason Row project. So, Mr. Shields, is your plan to bring sort of a policy framework before council? Is that what I heard you say?
Yes.
And for clarification, I hope you're not planning on making the council the decision maker on when it's appropriate. I mean, I hope that there is an escalation and possible council review, but I just want to put it out there. I don't think the council, at least in my view, should be getting in the weeds of, well, which street is going to get no parking, et cetera. I mean, I think that's going to put...
You don't want to work on that?
I do not want the council to be the parking enforcement. I mean, we have dedicated staff that can make that, and I don't think those issues should be politicized in the small capital P sense. So I just want to put it out there that I'm happy to review those if decisions aren't appropriately being made by staff, et cetera, but that should sort of be the last resort. And if there's sort of appeal processes, maybe it lands finally at the council decision, but it should not start there.
That's understood. And currently, parking regulations they don't come to council, and we wouldn't envision that in the future. But the way we administer requests for parking regulations is set forth in city code, and there is policy behind that, and that policy is to deal with commuter parking. And it also stands for the proposition, as the code is currently written, that our public rights-of-way should be available to all residents of the city. And so that there's the policy shift that we just need to address. One other aspect of it is that our existing policy stands for the proposition that on residential streets close to our commercial areas, again, for short-term parking, the parking on street is available to them. And so those are the issues that, with this type of density, right next to a residential neighborhood, we need to revisit those questions, or that basic policy framework. It's been asked of us, and we'll do that.
Sounds great. Thank you.
Could I ask when you're anticipating having a product for us to discuss?
I want to speak with the institution across the street, and unfortunately, that meeting has been hard to nail down because of some travel schedules by some of the key people there. So that meeting is likely not to occur until late October. But I want to get back to council very quickly after that.
I mean, I think it's important that, let me finish, then I'll
Yeah,
turn it over to you.
absolutely.
I think it's important that we have some information so that we can have that for consideration with the Masonry project. If, for example, you believe a plan is unworkable, that'll inform us on council as to what we might want to do with this project. So I would encourage you to try to get something to us as soon as possible so the neighborhood can have a chance to chew on it, as can we as well. Mr. Baruch?
Thank you. And just, again, this goes to the point that I was trying to make. I hope the policy is not sort of issue specific, so we're sort of jumping around, but it's a policy that addresses sort of infill that we're seeing on sites that are potentially being redeveloped or are going to be redeveloped. I mean, if it's too narrow and I think it's a broader stakeholder issue. I mean, we're seeing, infill happening throughout the city. So I hope we're thinking about it in more broad terms rather than just talking to an institution that on a given project is across the street, and then on the next project, we're sort of, to frame up the question, maybe that's fine, but I don't think the policy should be sort of narrow to address just one instance, because I think we're going to see more and more of it, and I don't think that we want to be continuously chasing the problem, if you will, because we already see it, and we've got one project that's already up that's mixed use that has other residential near it, and others that are in various stages, including Mason.
I think it's pretty predictable that this issue will come up again, and so it's a policy issue that needs to be addressed citywide, and it's not just driven by this project.
Okay, thank you. If I could also mention, thank Dan Z. The ULI is partially funded by a grant that we received after Dan had mentioned it and brought it to, I think, certainly my attention. So thank you, Dan, for that. Barb Kramus recently joined us again. I want to thank you for leading the effort. There'll be more information forthcoming, I think, at our next regular meeting. But we appreciate you taking the lead in collecting blankets for the refugees in Syria, a very worthwhile cause. So thank you. I appreciate that. Anything else, Mr. Shields?
That's it.
Okay, why don't we go ahead and call the first item then, Madam Clerk?
We have TO 1429, an ordinance to amend Ordinance 1918 and Ordinance 1919 regarding the budget of expenditures and revenues appropriating funds for fiscal year 2015 for the general fund and for the capital improvement project funds.
Mr. Shields?
And Council, I would just note at the outset that in the agenda for this meeting, it's noted that these two budget items will have a more work session style discussion of these, and it will be the council's decision as to whether you determine whether you're ready to act on these or whether we will continue to do some more work on those. That's understood in terms of the way the agenda was put together. The first budget item is the what we call the carry forwards ordinance, and we will go through the budget amendments that are requested for FY15 in more detail than we did at the work session last week. That is followed by a separate budget ordinance, which would allocate the water sale proceeds as discussed. I would note at the outset that the way that the numbers were drafted up, that sequence is on purpose, that the water sale proceeds, in terms of the numbers that are behind that ordinance, assume that the first one is acted on. And so if there are a desire to defer action on this or to change it, then we'll need to address those numbers in the water sale ordinance to make sure that they reflect that accurately. And then lastly, I would note also on the agenda, later on the agenda is a request for approval of a contract for Mary Riley Stiles Library so they can do additional space needs and parking analysis that will then feed into the capital improvements program that will come to the council in the spring. And it is the library board's request that if we're going to stay on track for that to be able to be considered as part of this CIP program, they really want to get this work underway in October so that they can get their report in November, and then we can make our capital planning decisions accordingly. So that is one of the ones that is time-sensitive in the budget ordinance and that contract approval. In the staff report, so if it's the council's pleasure, I will just provide more information on the funding requests and the carry forwards items. And if there are more holistic comments about the whole method that we're using for this, we're happy to have that discussion as well, and just want to make sure that the council is comfortable with these actions. Again, I think an issue that we would note from the outset is that these requested allocations come out of underspending. It's not the full amount of underspending, but they're related to either projects that were started and not finished in FY14 or initiatives that have been placed on the unmet needs in the FY15 budget development process. And then lastly, the third category are items that came up because of changed circumstances since the budget was adopted. So the first order of business is grants and contributions, and those at line 27, they total $159,000. The first set is $28,464 to bring forward community development block grants from the prior year. There are two allocations from seized asset funds, and Chief Gavin is here if there are questions about that. First, $62,315 for equipment for city police officers, and then $40,000 for lighting and outfitting an operations command van, and then lastly for bulletproof glass in the police records office. And then the fourth item in this category is $29,000 of donations and book sale proceeds for the library, and that will go back for the purchase of books and electronic resources. I can pause there for questions on those items.
Mr. Duncan?
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Manager. I had sent a note in earlier today flagging that I would be asking about the seized asset accounts. I'm sure all of us glanced at and perhaps read the post-covered seized asset fuel police spending, not speaking to false charge, but a national trend. And thanks to the chief for being here. I just would like everyone to feel confident that the way we are obtaining these assets and the way we're spending on them is at the forefront of transparency and rationality. So if perhaps you could just begin by explaining the difference between the categories. There's a category of assets, funds received from the Virginia Attorney General, and then there's a second category that just refers to them as seized asset funds. Are there actually two different asset funds that we're talking about here? And then beyond that, perhaps you could explain the kind of equipment and training and supplies that you generally look to spend these monies on, because as the article said, you know, these assets are not meant to be a budget tool, but rather kind of an opportunistic spending alternative. So that's sort of where I'm going, if you can help me out on those.
Thank you for the opportunity, Mr. Duncan. Each and every year, I think you're probably approached twice a year by us in terms of spending the seized assets. There are basically 4 categories in which we get our seized assets. One is the Department of Criminal Justice Services within the Commonwealth. The Attorney General one, the $62,000, that was a one-time Commonwealth grant of sorts from a settlement. And as you will find, there are many jurisdictions throughout the Commonwealth that applied for funding. And then we also have a Treasuries account for seized assets, and that one's federal. And so what we do with these seized assets is each and every year, we have officers that are working on certain task force, and we get a percentage of the seized assets from court cases and or cases born out of task force investigations. And that percentage of money comes to us through an e-transfer, and that money has certain boundaries as to how much and what we can spend. And it has to be for training, for personnel, it has to be for equipment, and or any type of new project. Then there is also seized assets that may be born out of a case that is local. And for instance, back in 2011, I think we had a drug case, and around the community we got $48,000 of drug money. And drug money you can use for seized assets. And during that period, you may remember we bought motorcycles, and we bought the Harley Davidsons out of that. Each and every year, what you will find too, which you don't find in most jurisdictions, is every time we do a budget amendment, we basically tell you what we're going to buy. And in most jurisdictions, you don't find that. So the checks and balances here in Falls Church, I think you will find, are above and beyond. Most of the things that we have bought are equipment and training and projects that we wouldn't be able to do on a normal budget process. I have a short history, if you want to hear it, as to what we have purchased with our seized assets, and welcome any other questions.
Okay, thanks. That seems responsive to the questions. I guess this is a new topic for me, and the difference between the various categories from which revenue comes. You referred to one-time settlement and some cases that are beyond our jurisdiction and some that are within our jurisdiction, so there's at least 3 different possible avenues from which money can come. And I think it's just useful when giving us information about how we're allocating to, be as specific as possible within reason of security. So the public has confidence in the amendment we're considering here. Protective gear is referred to, light equipment, which is lighting equipment.
Lighting equipment. There's a couple opportunities we've had in terms of lighting equipment. One is the intimate forensic lighting equipment that we've purchased for, may it be for body fluids, blood splatter, find evidence on a scene. We bought a chem light for that. The lighting equipment that's being purchased on this asset that we're asking for is actually for a command van. As you may recall, back when we had the homicide at the Eden Center, there was no place for anyone to gather for those hours at time, and there was no focal point for a command bus. We didn't have anything. So I had asked at the time if we could allocate our seized assets, which we had plenty of, to buy a modest size command bus for people to sit in so we could negotiate a scene and also light up a scene. Typically for a scene like that, they're out there for up to 12 to 24 hours. And it's usually pretty cold in the winter. And in that time, we didn't have anything other than the cruisers that they independently could sit in. So we asked for a command-type vehicle. It's a modest Sprinter-type van. fits about 3 to 4 people in the back that actually can negotiate a crime scene such as that. It also has a fairly expensive lighting. Now, it's spanned at 2 years, and the reason being is we ordered it, and then some of the parts and places did not come in, and so it's been 2 years since this has been on order. So we ordered the van and then to outfit the van. The other thing about CSDS I just wanted to mention is we have tried to, not only within the police department, supplement some of the things, the forward-thinking projects and things, but we tried to also assist the city in trying to build some of the infrastructure within for security and earmark some of that money for the city as a whole. But it's certainly something that you cannot supplant the budget with. We're cognizant of that. We make sure it's either a new project, a new position. Your fire marshal, when you first hired a fire marshal emergency manager, that position was new, and some of the assets that were to support that position were all born out of seized assets.
Okay,
So-
that's actually my final point or question, I guess, which is these monies often are opportunistic, and so it's difficult to plan for when exactly they're going to come in, I guess. To the degree that they can be synced up with our normal budget process, that just makes us more able to consider them in the context of all the other monies that we're considering allocating for public safety. And so whenever possible, it's helpful, I think, for us to be able to hear about these opportunities in the context of the regular budget process that we're working through, understanding that sometimes that's not possible, but that would be the ideal. Okay, thank you.
Ms. Oliver?
I just had a follow-up question, if you don't mind. What, in general terms, is the basis that the state and the federal governments use to allocate the seized assets? Are they based on activity on the local level, or are they based on statewide or nationwide activity?
It's usually regional or local. We participate in a task force that's regional. It also has to do with the Commonwealth itself. I mean, this last one, the $62,000 one, is a Commonwealth initiative. A lot of our seized assets from Treasury would go regional in the terms that we have some specialty in detectives that work with the feds to assist them in white-collar type crimes. And what's born out of that comes monies that are seized from arrests, white-collar crimes being, people moving money illegally. With drugs is typically money that's found in bundles with the drugs. That's local, typical.
And I'm just curious, are there any statistics, either on a per capita or per police officer basis for seized assets that can be compared across jurisdictions?
I don't have that on me tonight, but I certainly will look for you. Regionally, I'm certain they probably have. I can tell you in the task force that we are involved with in the regional, if you're a member of that task force and the whole task force comes together as a whole, the money is pooled, we get about 13% of the assets off the top from that. So we, as a small jurisdiction of 32 officers, are in the same house with somebody of a Fairfax County or a Prince William County, we get the same percentage of seized assets than they would if they're participating on that task force. But having said that, putting a detective out there for us is, that's a person.
Thank you.
That's not an urgent question, it's just maybe in next year's police report, if there's
Okay.
any comparative statistics. That would just be helpful to be transparent.
Sure. And I welcome when and if we do the budget amendments that, asking the question as to why we're needing or what we're buying.
Mr. Baruch?
So if my fellow council members can forgive me if I'm a little belabored here, but I'm going to be, as we talked about, treating some of this in work session format. So we haven't gone into detail on the line item issues, and I know that they've been grouped differently with a little bit more description, but I've got some questions some of the items. So I'm just going to start from the staff report and then move through it with the questions that I've got. So the first question that I have,
Before you get started, Mr. Shields, were you going to go through these section by section? I mean, just in terms of organization, you went through the first portion, which is the carry forward, right? And that's it, but there are other sections as well. Did you have questions on everything or just the carry forward?
this is actually on the next section. This is on the unmet.
So we can do this various ways. One, you can just go through the whole thing, and then we can ask questions, or we can do it section by section, whatever people prefer. Not sure I have a strong preference. How much time will we be spending on each of the items, the other items, Mr. Shields?
I'm not going to go and, I'll just touch on them so the public is aware of them, and then we can stop after each section for any questions about them, if that suits the council.
We can do that, or we can just do them all at the end. I mean, how long will it take you to go through the whole?
It would take me about 5 minutes to go through all of them.
Why don't we go through all of them, and then maybe
Fine.
have questions on any section of it that might occur to folks? And this is supposed to be technically a work session. It kind of sounds an awful lot like a regular session, but let's go ahead with it anyway.
Okay, so the next section at line 51 are the carry forwards from last year, and that's $117,000 for IT. We did have savings last year in IT because that came about through, in part, ending our outsourcing contract. But with that, we also have some transition costs that we're going through, and so we asked the council for those savings to be carried forward for FY15. Second, for West End Park, as part of our financing for that, the city issued $400,000 in bonds last year. The bids came in at $458,000, and we did ask in the council contract approval for a 15% contingency just for the management of the project. And so that $125,000 of savings out of Recreation and Parks would be put to that purpose. The unmet priority needs from 14 and 15, these were items that were sort of on the unmet needs list. The first at line 71 is $150,000 to replace 3 sheriff's department vehicles. Their current vehicles are 2004 and 2006 vintage. Those are used for prisoner transport, and then a 2008 vehicle for one of the deputies. At line 78, request is for 2 dump truck replacements. We would just note that they are 21 and 23 years old, respectively, the ones that we're replacing. These are the trucks that we use for, among other things, for our salting in the wintertime, and those that salt transport is brutal on these trucks. Both of these have had bed replacements in the past, which is a very cost-effective way to keep a dump truck in service. But we believe that at this point they need new transmissions, and the best value is to replace them. At line 9, item 90, item 5 is funding for a transportation planner. And this is an unusual request at carry forward times, because we just need to be very frank. This does have, if we go out and hire this position, have implications for FY16 budget development. And so usually for carry forwards, we don't have items that might have an operations aspect or a significant one for the subsequent fiscal year. This is brought forward in light of the changes in state policy, which have opened up significant new responsibilities and opportunities for the city to obtain funding, to execute projects using NVTA funding. It's a time when there's a great deal of policy work that is gelling that will have implications for the next generation. And right now, we are allocating approximately 1/5 of an FTE on this work. And so, particularly at this transition time, the request is for additional resources so that we can staff the regional meetings, so that we can protect the city's interests in those regional meetings. Vice Mayor Dave Snyder has significant experience, and so I think we're very well represented at these regional meetings, but the staff support is an area where we struggle. The other aspect of this job is in terms of project implementation. When you have your planner also working on implementation, our planner is doing the bus stop project, for instance, is doing our traffic calming projects. That's part of the job description, that we would be able to spread out to 2 people instead of the current 1. At line 137, we start items that it really just came up that were not on lists before. $130,000 for the rewiring of the traffic signal at Broad Street and Washington Street. This signal is failing. We have attempted to do just a simple rewiring, but because of the age of the signal, the conduit all needs to be replaced, and so that is the cost to do that. At line 151, item 7, $45,250 for additional Mary Raleigh Stiles library space needs and architectural study. This includes the parking component to develop a conceptual plan for public parking off of Park Avenue. The next item is $20,000 for the structural rehab of the Gage House. It's an old building. Council had funded rehabilitation to waterproof the basement and to fix the porch. And when we undertook that work, we found structural deficiencies that have increased the cost of that project by that amount. Number 9 is office space for the positions that were funded in the FY15 budget to help us implement transportation capital improvements projects. And so it's just simple changes to convert the conference room into a workspace. Item 10 is funding for CATCH, the City of Arts, Theater, Cultural, and History. The request here is to allocate additional funding in FY15 that would go through the CATCH allocation process. There is a request letter that's attached to the budget request that was in your work session packet, but we saw that it was not actually included in your regular session packet, so we'll distribute those letters. And there's some specific needs that request would address. At line 185, we've shifted then to other items that are not explicitly expenditures in FY15 that are new expenditures. One is administratively, I have taken the initiative to assign building permit fees that we receive this year to future development costs. This action would actually commit that funds through a budget amendment so that those funds are available to make sure that we have the inspectors and personnel on board when the Harris Teeter project, Reserve at Tenor Hill, Kensington begin to come online, and we'll have very intensive public safety inspection needs. And so that's just to really set that money aside so it can be used for that intended purpose in future years. The WMATA obligation of $200,000, we did discuss this one extensively at work session. I won't dwell on that again. And then at line 203, the $159,000 is proposed to cash fund the 3 police vehicles that were budgeted in FY15 to use cash instead of debt. That is a summary of them. On the capital project funds, the $125,000 for West End Park was referred to earlier. Then we do have some transfers between projects that are requested. The first is $152,000 from the Community Center HVAC project to the Facilities Reinvestment for the General Government Program. And those funds would be used to repair and remove asbestos from the original community center roof. So basically from HVAC to roof replacement at the community center. In the transportation fund, we would request that funding be moved from the, at line 236, $289,000 from the closed loop project to the Roosevelt Street sidewalk project. And the closed loop project is functioning through a wireless system, and we will reduce the cost by not extending fiber to all of the intersections that were part of the original scope of work. Item B, $132,660 from the bus stop improvements project to the Roosevelt and Roosevelt intersection project. We will replace the federal grants with state grants instead. Item C is $118,995 from the Broad Street Streetscape Project to the bridge replacement or renovation program. We did have a project in the CIP to do streetscape improvements along the 400 block of West Broad Street. We have a couple of issues with that project. One, we have lost a federal T21 grant that was obtained about 10 years ago, and that has been pulled back because this project was not able to move forward. One of the issues there is obtaining the easements sufficient to do a streetscape that meets the city's design standards. And so with those easement acquisitions, the project cost exceeded the available resources. The item 3, we have some changes reflecting some funding in the CIP for 2015 that would be there only if we were successful in getting grants approved. So at line 271, there's $800,000 in state grants for traffic signals. This grant was approved by VDOT from the revenue sharing program. And then item B, $255,000 of state grant for the bus shelters. We do have a local portion required of $465,300, which we have partially from the 70% NVTA funds and partially from the 30% NVTA funds. In addition, we'll be using some developer proffers for a portion of the local funding. So that is a summary of the requested amendments. It is extensive, and so I'm happy to answer any questions.
Okay, so Mr. Burke, you had, I think, some comments or questions. Why don't we start with you?
I think I appreciate staff's work on this. So I think this gets us sort of there on categorizing, but I'm still struggling to, on some of the items, determine sort of what are the critical issues and why are they coming before other priorities other than they're from last year. So that's how I'm viewing this context, is I'm trying to determine why on the carry forwards, for example, understanding that they're carry forwards, why we can't capture some of that cost savings and throw it into the budget mix next year, and then on the unmet needs, sort of why they need to come now rather than say during budget season when the sausage is made. So that's sort of the context of my comments, similar to what I talked about during our work session when we tried to take this on. So I'm going to start with the IT line item, and I'll say that sort of when you add up these carry forwards, et cetera, that's almost 2 cents of the tax rate. So this is pretty significant, while each item may be small. I mean, 2 cents when we look at where we're at next fiscal year is going to be large, given the amount of capital, et cetera, that we're taking up. So that's why I want to spend a little bit more time on these items, and just so we can put my questions in a little bit of context. So on the IT, I see that it's essentially a cost savings. I'm not saying sort of why it's critical that we take these up now. So if I can just go through these, and then I want to hear from council, and then we can hear from staff. So I just kind of want to lay these questions out there, have folks think about it for a minute before we have back and forth with staff on this, and get everybody's sense, and then react, so we're not just chipping it away at each one. But I'm not clear on why the 117 needs to happen now ahead of everything else that's in the pipe for next year's budget situation. So I question that on 2, which is the $125,000 carry forward on capital for West End Park construction. That project, in my view, is already underway, so this is closing a gap that's created. So I don't see how we don't put money towards that, since that's already been approved and is going to move forward. The moving on to number 3, which is the replacement of the 3 sheriff's vehicles. clearly a need, given the age of those vehicles, but again, I question why they're not going into the normal budget mix. It's one that I would likely favor, but I'd like to see that in the overall context unless we have sort of a big situation that can't wait until budget season. The dump trucks, the same thing with 150K there. The 80 grand for future transportation planner, that's something that I think needs to be given further thought about. I'd like to see a little bit more information. How many have we had, for example, in the past, Mr. Shields? As far as planners, I think we may have had more than one, but also some metrics being set out on how we're going to utilize that planner. So if we approve this, I want some assurances that we're not going to be dithering about policies dealing with on-street parking given the infill and the issues that we discussed during the manager's report. That would be one expectation, for example. The 130K towards rewiring, that's a clear safety issue that needs to happen sooner than later. So in my mind, that's how I rank that higher. So examples would be ongoing projects that we're doing, West End, lightage, on a failed light, get that. Would be another category that I would feel comfortable with at this point. Number 7, which is the Mary Stiles Library. The amount seems high. I understand that we requested it. I'm not fully understanding why it's at 45 plus K. Next item is 20K for the rehab of Gage House. I get that, that's already underway, so I don't have an issue there. The 15K for new staff, converting over a conference room we recently redid. Can we do cubicles? And I would like to hear, like, what are sort of, do we have standards for office space for staff based on sort of grade, rank, serial number, et cetera? An occupational series, I hope we have a policy out there. I'll defer to our general gov folks in that committee, but, you know, it's something for us to possibly think about long term. And then the catch fund, one of the questions that I had there is, and have been supportive of the arts, but again, in context, if this is sort of, we need to take action on this now because we're trying to leverage other grant money, I get it, and I would support it, but if it sort of doesn't need to happen until the budget season, and again, you know, I don't want to foreshadow what I would do, but I'm generally supportive of the grant. If it can be done, if it has to be done now, so be it, we can talk about it, but if it can be done during regular budget season, I would still be supportive, but I think it just needs to be in the mix at that point. And then just a technical question on the police vehicles and how we're financing it with cash rather than debt. What's the savings generally, and what's that going to be used for as a minutia type of question? So that's all I have. Thanks for bearing with me.
Okay, and I'd say before, again, we get to staff, why don't we go ahead and hear from others on council? It looks like, Mr. Z, you have a comment or question?
Thank you, Mayor. I also have a question on the library study at line 151 to 155, and I would like to understand the relationship between that and the additional 30,000 that's being proposed later in this to study and plan for a parking deck. And it seems to me that if you put them together, we have roughly $75,000 plus for basically the same thing. So if there's a relationship, I'd like that explained.
I would just note that there is a relationship between the two, but the budget amendment would allow the contract. So it's not an addition thing, it's the contract would be, we'd use the budget amendment to pay for the contract.
Okay. Further, I just have two more things quickly. I'm happy that colleague, Councilmember Brew covered many of the issues. We had discussed briefly the replacement repair of the streetlight that's been out over 18 months at the southwest corner of Park at Pennsylvania, and wondered whether you had additional information on on that particular life safety issue, and would it be appropriate to pay for this under the situational change priorities?
But why don't we go ahead and sort of have the global discussion after we hear from everyone on council? But if you'd like to answer that one question, and then maybe we can hear from everyone else and then have staff response.
I'm sorry, I was going to ask for a clarification of the question. So the signal was just put in at Park and Broad, and was the question, does it relate to the closed loop system?
No, this is no, bro. This is on Park Avenue. This is the
Okay,
yeah,
right.
this is the street light that was taken out by an accident.
Yeah.
I just happened to be there, walking my dog, when I saw the unfortunate white Toyota that took out the street light. That was over 18 months ago, and so we talked about this as an orange and white barrel now over this exposed wire, and someone had put a little piece of paper on this that said it's going to be all right one of these days. And now I see that piece of paper has disappeared. Maybe it got worn off by weather. I don't know, but it would appear to me that if we are going to fund situational change priorities, this could be a life safety thing that could be included in this tranche of funding. There is no other light on that corner. And probably the biggest thing is that I'm wondering what would be appropriate, or perhaps when it would be appropriate to talk about DMV Select. By my calculations for the number of people and the build out for the identified space comes to slightly less than $90,000 from the 1st of November to the end of June this current budget year. Thank you.
Okay, other comments? Did you have one, Ms. Conley? You don't have to have one if you don't want to. Okay, we'll go for it then.
So I just want to start with line 71. All the vehicles. And maybe this is, I don't remember seeing a list of, I know in the budget we look at unmet needs and requests. Is there a list that exists that these were pulled off of? This is the 15 unmet needs or the 70 unmet needs? Does that list exist somewhere in the budget document, or is it piecemeal throughout the budget document?
At the beginning of the budget book itself, we listed all the unmet needs, and these vehicles were included in those unmet needs.
And so these were at the top of the list of unmet needs?
Well, we didn't prioritize them. We gave you a list of all the unmet needs.
Okay. So in the future, can we prioritize them so that if we come to this situation again, we're able to say, hey, check, 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 these 5 things are taken care of? Or do those priorities change, and so they need to be readdressed anyway?
They can change. You know, all the prioritized needs are built into the budget that I would recommend to the council. The ones that don't make it in are either because of the fiscal constraint or through our internal vetting process, they just didn't rise to the top. This one is partially a question of timing, though, and so I think the circumstances have changed on this one.
Okay. So when we passed the budget in April, we asked both the schools and the city to cut $213,500 from their budget. Was there any attempt to reach out to the schools and say, we have extra money that we are going to cover unmet needs? Do you have any unmet needs? Is that appropriate for this kind of unassigned fund balance?
Generally, it doesn't happen. The school, if it has underspending, it takes care of it internally.
So,
unless there's a request that comes specifically to us, we wouldn't consider it.
So all this money is from underspending
Within the general
within the
government.
city allocated general government budget?
That's correct.
Okay. And the reason I'm asking specifically about vehicles is because I know one of the things the schools didn't buy was a bus.
That's correct.
Okay. And then my other question is just about the decision not to bond the police vehicles. And how did you come to that decision? Is there a process for that? How we decide what gets bonded and what doesn't?
Well, because we had this underspending, we decided that it would be appropriate to pay cash for it as opposed to bonding it. under normal circumstances, a vehicle with a useful life of 5 years would not be considered for bonding. And the only way that we are able to accomplish it is if we do a special way of repayment so that that item is paid for within 5 years as opposed to the normal bond life of 20 years. So when we have the opportunity to use cash, we try to explore that option.
And so this one, section D, other changes, that is also unspent funds that were allocated to the 2014 general government budget.
That's correct.
Okay. And I have one more question. Hold on. Where'd it go? Oh, line 255. Can you just tell me what the bridges program is? Is that specific bridges in Falls Church that need to be rehabbed?
Yeah, it's the Van Buren Bridge and the Oak Street Bridge.
Van Buren and Oak Street. So that would happen during this fiscal year.
Other comments? I've got a few. Ms. Conley, or Ms. Oliver?
On line 165, the office renovations, you say that this is the least costly solution is to convert the conference room into staff space. Did that take into account the opportunity cost of the times that we need that meeting because there's meeting in multiple conference rooms?
It's not the ideal solution, but it's really kind of the only solution.
The last meeting when Mr. Clinton was speaking about his desire to expand the DMV Select, he talked about space that was being underutilized by planning that could not be taken, that could not be used in some way to accommodate this.
The space that I think Mr. Clinton was referring to is the space where the customer service staff for the water utility formerly were. And that space is currently being used by the IT department. And I think ultimately the plan would be to have Housing and Human Services or another city office that is has more walk-in needs than IT does. But we've moved HHS in the last 2 years, and just in terms of the labor of moving them again, this is a short-term status to have IT where they are right now. It's a summary of that issue.
And then on line 219, I understand the need to repair and remove asbestos. I guess the question I have is, do we have HVAC needs that aren't being met by shifting this funding?
When we did a reassessment of the HVAC and determined that they could be rebuilt, the handlers, instead of a full replacement. Concurrently, we started having more leaks in the roof, and so did a reassessment of the roof and just reprioritized the project. So we will have stabilized in by 15 years on the HVAC while reprioritizing the roof.
What's that? You done? Yeah, I've got a few comments and questions. If no one else does at this time. One, I am concerned as well that we've come up with $700,000 or so in new spending, which, at least by my calculations of what shows up here, and I'm not disputing necessarily that there are not some real priorities in here, but I'm just a bit surprised that this has come up as it has outside the normal budget process. There's a lot of, I want to make sure that this gets adequate study and analysis. There's a lot of discussion about Mount Daniel, $1.1 million, let's say, in debt service. How is that going to be paid for? We've got about $700,000, at least as I read it, in new spending in here. And again, many of these appear to be things that are absolutely necessary and priorities for the city, but I do have concerns about that, and I have, frankly, concerns about taking hasty action. And I don't know whether there's a desire or feeling on council to have further study, for example, by the Budget and Finance Committee of these requests. Is there anyone here or any others on council who would like to see maybe a deeper dive into what's shown here? Maybe deeper than we can do as a council? Any comments, any thoughts? Mr. Baruch?
Well, I mean, I'd share sort of the sense that Councilmember Connolly raised about, you know, how do these fit within the various priorities? I know that they're coming from the priority list, but I think we have to acknowledge that they weren't prioritized. And I have no objection to having the Budget and Finance Committee sort of look at, you know, why are these coming up now, working with staff, or doing it tonight. I'm happy to hear that, you know, there is something critical that needs to happen tonight and move on that item if it fits within sort of the clear must happen now, or, you know, we lose funding if it's a grant program, or if it's a public safety issue that's immediate. So I don't want to be divorced from those realities where we need to act quickly, but I haven't quite heard that, but I want to make sure that we at least give staff the opportunity to do that. And again, I'm going to be very keen on if it's an immediate must-take action because there's an action forcing item or there's a clear public safety issue that we need to act on, or if it's something like the Gage House, and again, I'm speaking in hypotheticals because I don't know the schedule for that, but the contract is working along, construction is happening, and we got to pay for ex post, and if we wait 6 weeks, it's going to, you know, delay the project while we got, you know, things happening. I'm happy to hear that as well, but the problem that I'm having is these are sort of not laid out, and why now, why not during the normal budget process when it goes into the mix.
Mr. Duncan?
I'm trying to, Budget and Finance, I think, can play a useful role sometimes. Trying to figure the value that we add if we meet and discuss these things further, because individual members tonight appropriately are doing a good job of drilling down into the details. I mean, just to step back for a minute, I'm trying to square what we're doing here with, you know, council's responsibility in the manager-council form of government, not to micromanage, but to set policy and look to the staff to bring us proposals that fit within those policies. And I think it's very important, as everyone has said, to keep a very close eye on every penny we spend and its impact on the tax rate. The $1.6 million that's referred to on the first page is a percentage of the total budget that represents 4%, 4 or 5%. What does 1.6 million represent on our side, on the general government side?
130, about 3.5.
Okay, about 3.5%. I'm trying to get a sense of, you know, the scope of that kind of money being brought to us at this point on the calendar, number one, question I think we're all wrestling with. Two, the expenditures listed here, you know, how do they fit within priorities that we have identified and problems that we've encountered? Some of them I think clearly do. The transportation planner, for instance, as we're working on these development projects, I think arguably the most critical issue is traffic and neighborhood impacts on traffic, the neighborhood impacts of traffic. And so, I mean, that seems like a need that flows from work that we're doing right here, right now. We've talked, Mr. LeCondre, many times about the need to establish a vehicle fleet reserve fund so that we're not just carrying these vehicles way down the road beyond when they need to be carried. And, you know, what you've got with the dump trucks and the sheriff's vehicles is flows from that to some degree.
That's exactly right.
So, and then finally, the largest policy that I've been concerned about is are these expenditures keeping us within the unassigned fund balance number? And as I understand, the last page of this reflects that our unassigned fund balance would remain at or above 17%, which is our policy. So in some high-altitude respects, what we're seeing here tonight, I think, does represent what the City Council has asked you all to do. The details of it, as I say, I'm happy for Budget and Finance to meet and talk further about this, but I'm not sure that we are going to add a lot of value beyond what you're hearing individual members express. And I guess where that leaves me is, particularly all I would ask is that each of these be looked at carefully one more time to make sure that they do represent something that is anchored in policy that we approved in the last budget.
Mr. Baruch?
If I can just ask a point of clarification. My understanding of our policy about unreserved fund balance is anything going above 17% is supposed to go to a capital reserve.
That's correct.
That doesn't mean that it can't come up for budgetary spending, but I just wanted to point that out, that my understanding is not that if we hit 17% and go over, that we're going to put it into a operating budget.
No, that's not correct, and if you read the ordinance, it does tell you what is going into the capital
No,
reserve.
and I appreciate that, and that's helpful. I just wanted to clarify that I understood the policy correctly.
I mean, part of the concern I have is that whatever 6 months ago or 4 months ago, we didn't rise to the level of needing 3 new sheriff's cars or 2 new dump trucks, and now, you know, it didn't rise to the level that was in the budget that we passed. In other words, there were other competing priorities that won out, and that now, instead of, for example, 1 dump truck, and we'll talk about the other dump truck at the time of regular budget season, we need 2 or we need 3. And so, for example, those 2 expenditures equal a penny on the tax rate. And so I guess I have some concern that I don't want to be too hasty as well of just saying, okay, well, let's go from, you know, they didn't rise to the level of needing, you know, 5 of these vehicles, for example, 4 months ago. Now we need all 5 of them right now. And I guess to me, I really want some more thought, or I would feel more comfortable having more thought and discussion about it. I don't know whether that is for tonight, another day, or with another group such as the Budget and Finance Committee, or others feel differently and they're willing to vote on all of this or go through these one by one tonight. And that would be the question, I guess, for all of you. Mr. Baruch?
I'm happy to do it. I mean, I tried to set up a framework. I think we got partly there in the breakout. But again, what I'm not hearing is, why does this need to come now before the other budget priorities and into the mix of the regular budget season? And there may be reasons for that. I just haven't seen it in the staff report. I haven't heard it talked about tonight. I'm happy to talk about it tonight, or if staff needs another scrub at this to be able to identify some of these items, because some of these items don't strike me as meeting sort of the needs to come forward now rather than go in the regular budget mix, unless I'm missing some cues in the staff report that I'm not seeing.
Yeah, I mean, the ones, if we want to just run through them real quick, the ones that are sort of time sensitive and the reason why.
And I would just ask staff, I mean, you know, we have sort of, my expectation, just so we can have a frank discussion about it, it's really difficult as council members, you know, and if I can just speak for the group, and people can tell me that they don't agree, but looking at these, given our financial constraints that we're going to be facing, without context and sort of prioritizing when we're talking 2 cents when you add it up, is large. Yeah. Especially when we see, in my view, a lot of pressure on the tax rate coming up, and we're about to sort of spend 2 cents of it right now, without staff saying this is sort of an emergency and this is why, and us having a discussion about it. So I want to try to move it towards that discussion of separating some of the wheat from the chaff and things that need to go into the mix. And I don't want to make light of the other items, but there are items that maybe need to are action forcing again, and other items that we can put into the mix with all the other competing priorities. And I think that's, and I can't tell from the list that's before me right now.
Any other comments from other council members how to proceed tonight? Ms. Connolly?
This is just another, following what Mr. Baruch said, one of the complaints that you hear from the public sometimes is that we are pre-taxing people by collecting that 2 cents that we didn't actually need, and then later on figuring out a way to spend the money. So what I would like is a transparent way to show that that isn't what happened, that indeed the tax that we charged last year was what was needed and what is being spent.
Other comments? Mr. Snyder?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I certainly appreciate the oversight that we're engaged in here, but I think we got to move on some of these items tonight. So I would ask the city manager to provide his best recommendation on which items we should move tonight.
This would be a work session, though, on this item, so this would be actually first reading at the next meeting. Is that correct, Mr. Shields?
I would like to, excuse me, Mr. Mayor, I'll move to vote on first reading for those items that need to be funded tonight. I'm not gonna delay police expenditures. I'm not gonna do it. So other people can vote the other way, but I want to see what needs to be done tonight on first reading. Otherwise, we postpone this to first reading on October 27th, which means you don't have first reading until sometime middle of November. And if there are issues which we need to address now, I want to address them now.
Well, I don't know if it's been advertised properly for first reading tonight.
I think it has been.
Yeah, it is on the agenda, so it's available for action on first reading if the council so chooses. The way the agenda was laid out is it just noticed the public and for everybody's expectations that we're going to have this type of detailed discussion that's more typical of a work session. And then it's up to the council. If the council wants to act, it can. And also, this is just first reading, and so it can change between first reading and second reading if the impact is reduced.
And since I sort of take some responsibility that I, raised this at the work session last go around, but I'm supportive of Mr. Snyder's notion of identifying again what I've been trying to get at are what are the sort of emergency must take action now because there's a clear issue and separating out the various categories. And I think we're getting there, but I want to definitely hear from staff on items that we have to move tonight. And I'm asking staff to sort of, use your compass. You've sort of heard from me sort of how I'm seeing things, how I'm using the governor or my governor on how I'm separating these buckets. I just think we need to take that type of approach, at least in that framework. So I think I've done a lot of talking, and I'm happy to hear from staff at this point.
Okay, so just briefly on the carry forwards then, the IT expenditures, that is time sensitive in the context of with the transition, there are items that are sort of core server items where we don't have the supporting documentation to ensure that if they break, we know how to fix them. That was part of the transition that was not satisfactory. We did save some money with respect to the contract closeout to pay for doing that type of sort of after-the-fact correction to make sure that our core IT servers and infrastructure can be maintained properly. Item 2, the park that's been discussed, and I think that's fairly self-explanatory. The sheriff's vehicles.
Sorry,
I'm sorry.
that's self-explanatory that it's urgent, or self-explanatory that it's not urgent? It's not self-explanatory to me.
To the extent that the council has given the go-ahead for the contract, and we currently don't have the budget in FY15 to cover the contingency and about $50,000 of the contract cost.
Okay.
So what happens if we approve that and then there's money left over? Will that then be unspent funds next year?
It would be. So anything that's unspent would then revert to unassigned fund balance, which is where it is right now. And I would just note for the West End Park, we suspected that the bids, because that $400,000 price was arrived at in 2008, so we suspected they were going to come in higher, and so Danny, in terms of planning for that, tried to set aside funds in Rec and Parks budget to plan for that eventuality. With respect to item 3, the sheriff's vehicles, one of the aspects of with housing prisoners in Alexandria to lower costs with jail costs, the issue of prisoner transport is an important one for the sheriff's department, and we're doing that currently with some vehicles that are older than the sheriff, I think, responsibly would like to have to do that type of work. We do not want to break down on the road when we're doing a prisoner transport.
And it's also increasing our repair costs, because to make sure that we keep them running, we have to spend money on cars that we should probably replace.
Conley has a question.
Okay.
Is there an option to replace 2 of those vehicles and not all 3? So that they're not on the same, do we have more than 3 vehicles in the sheriff's department?
Yes.
We do. These were identified as the top priorities by the sheriff.
Okay.
And so we're conveying that to the council. The dump trucks, we intended to make those purchases in 2014. What blew the hole in the Public Works budget was the signal rewiring project. And so as we were diagnosing that project, we knew it was going to be expensive. We didn't know how expensive it was going to be, so we held off on the dump trucks until we had a price and an estimate for the rewiring. So for that reason, that spending was not done in FY14, but we still do have the need for the dump trucks. And so from underspending elsewhere in the city budget, we're requesting that funding now. The timing issue for that is related to snow removal and leaf collection, which is right upon us. The transportation planner, this one is just in terms of trying to get our hands around these transportation issues. I think the council is aware of what those issues are, and that's what's driving the timing on that. The rewiring of the traffic signal, we do think we have significant vulnerability today with the status of that signal. It has failed twice, and it was very difficult to get it going again in the last 6 months with some workarounds to basically just get it to function again. So we do believe that one is time sensitive. The library space needs, that is, the library board does want to get that work underway and have a report finished by November. And so the contractor that did the work last year is basically on standby for a budget action. There's also the council action, which actually would get ahead of the final budget action on second reading in October. But if the council did approve the contract tonight, then we would proceed with the work with the understanding that would happen. The budget work would then happen after the fact with second reading. The Gage House, that's basically work that's happening right now. If this funding is not approved, then elsewhere in the facilities budget, there'll be a reduction somewhere of work that won't get done.
Structural safety.
The office renovations for Public Works, that is work that we're undertaking right now, and I'd say that's similar to the Gage House in that if the budget is not amended, then there will be other maintenance work this year that will not get done. And then the Catch Foundation program, you have the letter. I think you've been contacted by the Catch representatives on this issue, and so what the issue is in terms of the Creative Cauldron, in terms of their lease terms, it's a triple net lease, and so they have liabilities that they need to cover in that lease, and so that ultimately is what they would go to the Catch for to request funding for. That's an operational grant in 2015. That's a summary of the items that have an impact in terms of the use of fund balance.
Okay, any comments from folks? Ms. Conley?
On the Catch grant, this is $25,000 for this year. I'm assuming that this will be an ongoing request from Catch for years to follow as well?
The way it's proposed in your budget amendment, it would be a one-time $25,000 for this year, and then as part of the FY16, it'd be part of, as referred to earlier, the full sausage making. During last year's budget cycle, staff had proposed a larger amount than the $20,000, but when the prioritization came through, what came forward to council was $20,000. So this would be an additional $25,000, but next year it'd be reviewed in its whole priorities. And in the correspondence from Catch, and as you can see, there's several members in the audience during the public comment part of this ordinance, would be able to further answer questions. But the core issue with the Creative Cauldron lease space is during the proper negotiations, those additional expenses, predominantly the real estate and the common area maintenance, weren't part of the negotiation, as we realized after the fact. And so they are Creative Cauldron, who's our main leaseholder for art space, along with Falls Church Arts, is bearing the real estate 3 years' worth that they owe to the city. So it's been deferred, but they'll need to settle that. And so that's why this is here as a time-sensitive matter, but it's a one-time request.
Other comments, questions from council? Mr. Snyder.
Thanks, Mr. Mayor. Now let me take this list and let me understand it. First of all, well, let me review it. I think I understand it, but let me get it on the record. Grants and contributions, which is under General Fund A, those are not paid for with tax revenue. They're grants and contributions, right? Correct. So it would make no sense to delay those for budgetary reasons, and in fact, they all seem to be justified. So if I were putting together a motion, which I will, it would be to approve A, 1, 2, 3, and 4. Then the carry forwards, we've heard the city manager discuss them. Looks to me like I don't see points where they don't need to be addressed here very, very promptly. Otherwise, we, in the case of the transportation funding, may lose critical funds in the future, and we seem to be replacing things like trucks that'll move snowplows for this winter and vehicles that transport prisoners. I don't see how we avoid funding those. Rewiring the traffic signal, I think we've been told that's a safety issue. The Mary Stiles Library, I'll ask the people that work with the library board to comment on that. Structural rehab for Gage House, it seems to me that may or may not be delayed. Office renovations to accommodate the additional, that's 9, that may be delayed. Catch, it seems to me the arts have produced a lot for this community, and one way or another we're going to need to fund that. And then is it my understanding that the rest of these are all movements within the existing budget and are not additional?
Yes.
On all the capital projects, yes.
Right.
So I'm prepared to move as follows, that we approve on first reading the following items. General Fund I, A, all the items under A. B, carry forwards 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 8, and 10, that we move forward all the items under C and D and all the items under capital project funds.
Comments from others? Mr. Baruch?
I'm good with that.
Others?
Can I just wanted to comment on on item 7, which you left off the list, about the library space needs and the parking study. If the library is to come up with something reasonable for the CIP process this year, they need the study funds? You basically shut them out of the CIP process if they can't move forward with this. I think it's fairly time sensitive. They're trying to get this done by November.
And Mayor, if I could, for some background, during the last year's CIP process, as you recall, the library had proposed an all-new building, and during the Planning Commission process and what council adopted was a smaller dollar amount with them to go back and look at renovation and rehab. And so part of that directive, about 30,000 of this contract amendment, is to do that. And then in the discussion of the parking shortfall for the library, because that plan had no parking in the area parking, then we started looking at what could be done adjacently, and that's the additional 13,000 that brought it up to a little over 45,000. Ms. Oliver is correct. If this is not done this November, then staff will not be able to finalize it for Planning Commission presentation in January for your all's action by April, and so it would put 1 year process delay to the library.
Thank you. Other comments?
For all the reasons they're stated, then I would concur with Ms. Oliver's point on this, and before seconding Mr. Snyder's motion, which I do intend to do, I'd ask that he include item number 7 in the list of items to be funded, if he'd be willing to do that.
Consider that a friendly amendment.
I haven't seconded it yet, but whatever the procedural proper is.
I just think someone needs to make a motion to amend the motion before you, and you vote on the amendment, and then you have the second motion before you, once you've voted on the amendment.
I move to amend the motion with the inclusion of item 7.
Second.
Okay. Any other comments from council? Why don't we go ahead and open this to public comment? Is there any member of the public that wishes to address this item? I see that Mr. Wong has a speaker slip. Would you like to address council, Mr. Wong, at this time?
This is Victor Wong, 914 Park Avenue. I just want to concur with Ms. Connolly said, that basically you're pre-funding revenue to spend later down the line. I don't have any problems with urgent needs to be taken care of with these funds, but I don't approve of spending extra money for expected costs. I do look at the West End Park. Do we really need the full park that you guys want to renovate? If you just do major landscaping, it might be just beneficial. You don't need to spend the extra 125 for that. So it's just something along those lines. It's just be more cautious of how you're going to spend the money. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Wong. Are there any other members of the public that wish to address this item? Yes, ma'am. Please come forward. Could you please state your name and your address? Thank you.
I'm Rohini Winters. I live at 324 Grove. Sorry I didn't get a slip in. I appreciate the council and the staff putting together this. I attended the work session last week, and I learned a lot. Councilwoman Connolly, I thank you for bringing up the school bus issue. I wanted to suggest that if you can't put off some of these necessary expenditures from the unspent funds, that you should ask what else has been unmet and let the public know what those items are that are not being addressed. Because my first grader is sitting 4 to a seat on the school bus. And if you talk about a new complex coming in that might bring 60 to 100 children, that's at least one busload across the city. Even if they don't all live there and go to one school, there's an impact, and I don't think the proffers are being looked at along those lines. So regarding the tax cent, I would say that was my question, and you did aptly ask it. Why are we underspending? If we charge the taxpayer, there's something wrong with the execution process. If we have this much money that was just budgeted for, I could see if it was budgeted 2-3 years ago and it didn't materialize. But I have a concern with the way the process is not well known by and understood by the citizenry. And so as we look at 3 cents to fund the bond referendum versus 1 or 2 cents that we're going to not save because we have things we can spend on now, it raises questions. And I think we are doing ourselves a disfavor when we see bad press. It falls on the city as a whole, and I'm part of the city, and you're part of the city, and the schools are part of the city, and I think we can do a little bit better.
Thank you very much. Are there any other members of the public that wish to address or comment on this item? Seeing none, the matter is closed to the public. Are there any comments from members of council? Ms. Conley?
This is just a comment on the catch grant. Mr. Shields, did you just say that part of what this grant would go to would be paying the property tax, or did Ms. Mester just say that? The property tax that they owe the city?
Yeah, so
We
to
just
be a
expunge that, and then we wouldn't have to,
Under state
we
code,
can't
no.
expunge that?
So the treasurer's been kind to defer it while we work through many other options before this came before council. They deliberated quite hard. So it would be a competitive grant. The catch has committed that the first largest part would go for that. There'll be a couple thousand left over to help another grant, nonprofit.
But we can't just say that that tax is not due.
But it's coming right back.
No, we're governed by very strict state laws on that, and so we've always envisioned that a grant process or some sort of fundraising mechanism would be the best way to handle that.
Any other comments?
Could I just ask a question about the school bus? I mean, obviously, we don't want our children traveling in unsafe conditions. My recollection of the school bus issue was not that, you know, anybody was told not to buy a school bus. It was just the manner in which they were to finance it. I mean, if there's been some miscommunication that we did not believe that, you know, the schools suggesting that they need a bus was listened to, then I think we need to clear that up right here, right now.
My recollection or my knowledge of the school bus is that when the schools were asked to cut that amount of money from their budget, that was what was the decision to cut. Is that right, Mr. Kimball? So it was in there as a need, and that was what one of their unmet needs was a school bus. But then ultimately, there was no decision to fund it by bonding?
That's where that's the question I wanted to ask, because that was my recollection of where it was left.
That is where it was left, that it was a need. However, instead of paying cash, we were looking at bond financing that particular item.
Okay, and y'all just haven't decided to do that yet, but that is an option to you. Okay, thank you.
Okay, any other comments? I would just say that I think I don't feel comfortable that we have enough information, or I have enough information to feel this is the priorities for the city. I don't think the public's been adequately informed that we are deliberating about this. It's come up recently, very quickly, and I don't think they've had adequate time or notice to know what's going before us today. So I have concerns about this motion and taking action tonight. But let's go ahead and call for a roll call vote, Madam Clerk.
May I ask, is this is first reading, right? Move to grant first reading?
Yes.
Okay, so we would take this up again in 2 weeks if it were to pass?
Yes.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, Madam Clerk, will you call the roll call vote?
And we're calling the vote on the amended motion.
Yes.
Okay.
Did you second?
Mr. Baruch?
Yes.
Ms. Conley?
Yes.
Mr. Duncan?
Yes.
Ms. Oliver?
Yes.
Mr. Snyder?
Yes.
Mr. Z?
Yes.
Mayor Tarter?
No.
Motion carries.
Okay, thank you. Let's move on to the next item if we can.
Our council, the next item is a budget ordinance, again, and this would allocate the water sale proceeds. The net proceeds from the sale of the water system are $20.5 million. And the budget amendment that is before the council would allocate those as follows. $10 million would be invested to earn for the taxpayers perpetual return on investment of principal in the city pension fund, and $10.5 million would be allocated to capital reserves, which would be applied towards specific city facility and infrastructure projects through the capital improvements program and later action by the city council, and provide a benefit for the taxpayers in debt avoidance and infrastructure renewal. This ordinance is before the council for first reading, and a public hearing and second reading is scheduled for October 27th, 2014. There's been a great deal of deliberation and very careful thought over the past year by the City Council in determining a framework to go out to the public to get public input on the allocation of the water sale proceeds. We've discussed it at a presentation that I provided for the public at your last City Council meeting, and then on Saturday we had a town hall meeting on the topic as well. And one of the key things to communicate in terms of this allocation is that in the short term, the anticipated return for the taxpayer relative to investing directly in capital infrastructure, school facilities or city facilities, versus investing in the pension fund. In the short term, the expected returns are quite similar in terms of the ability to reduce costs for the taxpayer. In the long term, however, the pension fund option does provide the opportunity for there to be a return on investment of principal, which will continue to accrue a benefit for the taxpayers indefinitely into the future, whereas typically the benefit to the taxpayer directly in a budgetary sense, in terms of a tax rate sense, for direct investment in capital infrastructure is the term of a bond, which is 20 years typically for the city and how we traditionally finance things. And so those are the principal actions that this ordinance would take. It would set aside $10 million that would be then invested in the pension plans, the city basic plan and the police plan, and it would be allocated between the two based on their current unfunded actuarial liability, which currently stands at $9.2 million. The $10.5 million would be allocated to the city's capital reserve fund, where it would then be appropriated through the annual adoption of the capital improvements program. And the first such action would be this year in April, after the development of the capital improvements program with board and commission input, the planning commission's recommendation, and public hearings. I would just note that at line 59 in the staff report, there are two options that the council may consider that would reflect comments that were made at the last work session about further describing how the funds in the capital reserves would be used. We should note that City Council cannot bind future councils, and so we offer this language with some reservations because future councils could change this by ordinance, but B, we would just note that if a contingency arose where funds had to be allocated for a project that might not meet this criteria, but for good reasons it needed to be used for that purpose, the council would need to come back and amend this ordinance before it could take that action. And so we just note that for the record, but the language is offered as one way to capture the intent, I believe, that we heard at the work session. And that intent has been articulated many times over the past year in the council's deliberations on this. One thing I would just note as well, that as part of the discussion about financial planning in general, which the water sale proceeds are a part of, the council has had discussions about the Mount Daniel financial plan, and at our last work session we discussed the different options for bonding the project or for cash funding a portion of it to reduce the debt service cost, and those ultimately will be factored into a decision by the council that will be made with the approval of a bond resolution for the Mount Daniel project, which would be before you in November. So with that brief report, I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Questions? Questions for Mr. Shields? Mr. Z?
Thank you, Mayor. On line 40 and 41, the statement reads, a final calculation for 2014 by the retirement board's actuarial firm is expected soon. Is that still an accurate statement?
What we've received is their draft of actuarial evaluation for 2014. And so what I've shared with the council has the word draft over it, but we think it is reliable for planning purposes for right now.
When do we expect the final report?
We've been pushing them, and so I would like to think it will be you will have it before second reading on this.
I think that's critical. Thank you.
Other comments? Mr. Snyder?
Mr. Mayor, I'll reserve comments until after we do a public hearing, but I do have a number of comments.
Mr. Duncan?
I think I have a question. Could you just go back and say again what you said about the November action when we work on the bond resolution itself? If at that juncture, it makes financial sense or it's financially possible for us and council so desired to buy down to some extent the cost of the bond, would we still have the leeway to do that then? Or is what we're doing now precluding us from taking that action?
You would have the leeway to do that and with your action in November.
Thank you.
Okay, well, unless we have any other questions, why don't we go ahead and open up to public comment? I know, Mr. Wong, it sounds like you have a speaker slip, and any other member of the public is welcome to speak at this time as well. So why don't we let Mr. Wong go ahead if you'd like to speak to this issue, sir, and then anyone else who might wish to speak could come next. If you could please state your name and your address and limit your comments to 3 minutes.
Victor Wong, 914 Park Avenue. My first comment is to the city and to the city manager is that I understand that the city has their retirement program with the Virginia retirement system, and that is the defined benefit program. But if you look at the website of the Virginia retirement system, they actually have a new product. It's a hybrid system. It's a hybrid product. It's a benefit of a defined contribution with a defined benefit. By being strictly defined benefit, you're putting the onus of any shortfall that any investment happens is that the citizens of the city are not responsible. By having a hybrid and using a defined contribution program, you can now share the risk with the employees in terms that they are also responsible for their future retirement programs, is that they will have a contribution from the city and that they can also look at their investment programs or profiles that you can provide for them. Is there a concept of, with the city retirement board, your HR professional looking at that? Because I look at the pension program, using just the water to pre-fund this program, is that you're hoping the actuary is correct and that their investment will bring the desired return, that you will meet your expected payouts for the employees. But if we have another crisis and the market goes down, the citizens of Falls Church will have to make the difference up. So I'm just looking at, we need to think of other ways to fund these kinds of programs, or not hurt the employees, but also to provide other options for them. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Wong. Is there any other member of the public who wishes to address this matter? Seeing none, the matter is closed to the public and is now with council. Council member comments. Mr. Snyder?
Thanks a lot, Mr. Mayor. Let me offer a couple perspectives on this. The first is that while we've been discussing this for many, many months, the reality is that the first and only town hall that we've had specifically on this topic was last Saturday, basically, 3.5 days ago, 4 days ago. In that town hall, which many of us, I think we all attended, as another indication of how we try to do the public's work, there was a range of opinions. Some thought that the idea of putting half of it into the pension system and half into some sort of capital fund was a good approach. Some raised some very interesting and significant questions about it. Some challenged some of the analysis, that famous chart that shows the drop-off of the value at 20 years if you put it into a capital project, of course, ignores the fact that because you've provided that capital project, you won't have to do it beyond 20 years, and so there was no accounting of the value to that. And so we're going to vote on this on first reading. Unlike the prior project subject, which involved a lot of money, this involves about $20 million. So we haven't even seen a good summary of the citizen comments from that period, and yet we're going to go ahead on first reading. So I have a question about that. Second question I have is, relates to the legal issues. I've never pressed for a legal opinion of the city attorney to be made public. Certainly, the circumstances where we've asked for that, we've been in litigation where publicity would harm it and benefit an opposing party. In this case, this is a policy issue. This is not an issue in litigation. This is an issue that I feel very strongly about, that I think we should have a clear written legal opinion from our city attorney, and that opinion should be made public. And the reason why I say that is, number one, the huge amount of money. Number two, it's a policy issue. Number three, we've already been told this has never been done in Virginia before. And while there's been some good initial legal work done, the fact of the matter is it's not been public, and we have not had a firm, definite opinion from our current city attorney that it's acceptable to do this. Now, the risks of doing this, or once you put the money into the pension system, you can't get it out. And if something robbed us of the projected value, it will not have been a good action to take. So until I get a formal written legal opinion that is made public, I will not vote on this issue. It's up to the council members when and if you all want to vote on it. But I think this is important enough that we need that. I would also note that we're relying on actuarial opinion. I happen to work in the financial services, and that one part of financial services actually that didn't cause the financial crisis. I've seen actuaries been wrong, dramatically wrong. I note that in response to a question which I asked of the city attorney, or rather the city manager, where he responded to my question about volatility, which was raised by one of our citizens on Saturday, which again illustrates the value, it seems to me, of us carefully examining what the citizens said on Saturday. Changes to the annual returns will be managed through the annual budget process. Now, presumably that means if the actuaries are wrong in a given year, or a given several years, it could create a major budget hole, and that's going to have to be managed in the future. So this alleged constant line, if you will, on close analysis becomes anything but a constant line of return. So I appreciate the work that's gone on here so far, but I think fundamentally the issue for me is that we've gotten some citizen input. I don't think we've gotten enough. We're going to propose, the proposal is to go to second reading within 2 weeks. We're going to be spending $20 million, having had one town hall and moving on first reading within 3 days of that. And the results of that town hall haven't even been summarized for the record. But more importantly, I think because this sets a precedent, because if the city invested money directly, it would be limited severely as to what we could invest it in. The question is, will we be challenged because we seek to do it indirectly and get a higher return? So for all those reasons, I just wanted to lay out that I'll be abstaining from the vote tonight, and it's up to my colleagues as how they want it to go, but I wanted to share these issues with everyone. Thank you.
Thank you. Other comments from other folks? Mr. Z?
I think that would be to the good if we could take a few more steps toward defining the sense of council on what we see the best deployment for these funds are. We've had numerous discussions. We've now had a town hall. I certainly understand we don't have all the data points in yet, and I have significant issues with the finality that's conferred by the way we split this money up, and I don't know that anyone is of mind that if we don't come to a second reading by the end of October, that the world will come to an end and we'll not be able to pay our bills. I think with an abundance of caution, I would prefer to wait for the final report to come in and be public and have that be part of the record. And that would be the first major point. The second one is I just don't know that we need to lock in the rest of this money at this time. There are just too many unknowns that could arise that could impact these funds. And of course, we're all waiting for the Fed to stop buying up bonds, and they're not going to do that before Christmas. Thank you.
Other comments? Mr. Baruch? Ms. Conley?
So my thoughts on this have changed about 10 times. Every time I learn a new piece of information, I think, oh, that's what I think. And then I learn another piece of information and think, oh, that's what I think. So I'm just about convinced that using the pension fund would be a good idea, but I really have some concerns. And I don't know that there's a way to address them right now, but here are my concerns. One is that the money that's going to be the $700,000 or $750,000 that we're going to recoup every year is coming out of operating budgets, and then it's going to be deployed as capital, possibly, if it is used to go towards the Mount Daniel bond. So how's that going to be accounted for? It kind of goes back to our previous discussion about how we're accounting for money and where it is and what each pot of money is designated for. So I have a concern just that if it's, let's say it's $700,000 and the city's contribution would be $500,000 comes out of the city operating budget and $200,000 out of the school's operating budget for the school's part in that. How do we account for that? How do we make sure we keep track of that? In 3 years, are people going to remember that this, because it's not that huge of an amount of money, it could very easily get lost. So that is a big concern of mine, is that it's going to get lost. And if we go ahead with this, we need to sort of put a golden rope around it or make a brand new budget category that says water sale dividends, so that next year and the year after and 10 years from now when there's another council, they'll understand what it was that we were trying to accomplish here. And it doesn't just get lost in the shuffle. And that, I think, would be very easy to happen. And then back to the prioritizing conversation that we just had. I think if we're going to put this into the other half of the money into capital reserves and this money into a pension fund, we need to prioritize exactly what it is that we see as the highest and best use of these funds so that everybody in the public knows exactly what it is that we would like to spend the money on and that we're gathering public input on that.
Other comments? Ms. Oliver?
I have one comment and one process question. So if this made it through first reading and the amount of funds that it made sense to place into the pension fund changed, would we have to start over again with first reading, or would we be able to go to second reading?
I think it's likely, if there's a change in the substance of the ordinance, then you have to go back to first reading. So I think there's a very good likelihood you would have to go back to and start over with a new first reading if you're going to change the amount. I suppose at some point it might be non-substantive, but I think that would have to be a very small amount of change, which is probably not what you'd be doing.
Okay. So what I hear you saying in a sense is that if we don't have the final figure for what it makes sense to put in the pension fund, first reading is a risk.
Well, I don't know that it's a risk because it's not going to harm you, but you might have to do it again. That's correct. It might not be useful because you might have to do it again if you change the number.
Mr. Baruch?
Just on that process point, the number that we need to fully fund the pension system, I think, has gone down since we started looking at this question. So my question for the city attorney, getting to Ms. Oliver's point, if the number were to change but be reduced rather than go up, would that also kick off a new first reading?
I don't think so, because I think the charter provides that if the ordinance changes as to substance, it doesn't matter whether it goes up or down, a new first reading is required.
Okay, just again, without sort of weighing on the merits, that number is going to be in flux for a while until the money gets sort of spent on there. Can we come up with a way that, in the language of the ordinance, that we are fully funding it at X percentage rather than a number. That way we're not in this situation.
Perhaps you could set that it's a number up to a certain amount determined by actuarial figures or the need to fully fund the pension fund at the time.
So we can change the language that way and
And
then
then-
put the rest of it into the capital fund.
Correct. Then you would have some flexibility in the final amount.
Just on the merit side, want to get more comment on this issue, but I'm hearing that wording may not be exactly right, and I don't want to end up in a spiral where we're going back and forth on the first reading, or somehow then overfunding it over 100% because of a number we pick. So we may need to work on that language, but at this point in the process, I'm at 100% of the funding, with the remainder going towards the capital reserve, and then figuring out how much of that we are going to distribute up to, I think $1 million is what we were talking about for immediate items. So that's my thinking. I question whether the language is there right now, so we're not in the washing machine cycle of flux, but that's where I'm on the merits.
Well, I mean, you could come up with the language if that's what you wish to do, to make a motion with that.
I'm gonna ask the city attorney to work up that language rather than trying to do it from the dais up here.
For
But
tonight?
For if members are willing to entertain the motion, I'm happy to put it forward.
Okay. Ms. Oliver?
Sorry, my other comment was that there hasn't been any discussion this evening about lines 59 versus line 67, about which of the wordings we want for the remainder of the money that does not go into the pension fund. And I am not entirely happy with the language on lines 71 and 72. I think in the discussions about the $1 million for immediate capital needs, there have been some other restrictions or some other categories of spending that have been suggested. I don't know whether we don't want to put that language in there or whether we can't put that language in there. But in the comments above, there's a specific discussion on lines 52 and 53 about immediate public improvements for the downtown commercial district. I think I've raised the point about making the immediate spending go towards something which can generate future revenue for the city. I don't know where the rest of council is on 59 versus 67, and whether anybody else has concerns about the no further restrictions.
Other comments? I mean, with respect to that particular note, I would like to see at least $1 million on immediate spending, with the idea that it'd be used to improve our downtown districts. But even further than that, possibly traffic calming or things for basically just through the city, not necessarily for only the downtown, but for sprucing up our city and our community in various ways. I'm not sure $1 million is adequate. Frankly, I would be fine saying up to $2 million for that purpose, not necessarily to use it, but up to that amount. And I don't know what other people think of that as well. But I would be willing to vote on a motion, if there were such a motion, put forth tonight. But I don't know whether there's a desire to have that, and whether someone wants to put forth a motion, and we'll find out. Any other comments, Mr. Duncan?
So I guess it had been my assumption and hope all along that because the topic we're talking about here is to some degree related to market conditions and numbers that we cannot know the night that we vote, that this would be able to be worded in some way, and I see the city attorney working hard to do it right now, which is why I'll keep talking, that would, accommodate the need for that flexibility, within reason, of course. not changing the substance of what we're doing, but acknowledging that, you know, this is somewhat unique and that we're passing something that takes us into the market where, you know, dollar figures can change right up to the minute that we drop the money in. So if it's possible to do that, I would concur with Mr. Baruch's guidance that he offered. As to the line 59 or line 67, I don't know. I go back and forth. As was indicated in our debate on the earlier topic, very mindful that there are many pressing community needs. In the previous item, we voted for funding for law enforcement, public safety, utilities, operational effectiveness, library, arts, transportation, neighborhood traffic calming. I mean, I like that because it indicates a, you know, awareness on council that we are more than just the one or two things that often get a lot of the discussion and publicity. So that, you would think, would lead me to support the Section 2 language, where we spend $1 million on those kinds of needs. That's sort of how I read that language. I mean, it says immediate capital needs. But on the other hand, I'm mindful that, you know, from the very beginning, the way I viewed this, and it is very complicated, but sometimes when you have something complicated, just try to boil it down. We used to have a water system, and it was an annual performing activity. It threw money off. We used that money to do a lot of things over the decades. We sold it, and now I'm looking for a way to deploy that money that is as long-term and as sort of community-wide and visible as possible. And I am concerned about $1 million here and $1 million there sort of getting lost and frittered away. I agree with Ms. Connolly that whatever we do, I want the legislative record to show that the intent of this council sitting here was that these monies be deployed to long-term capital needs. That's why I've personally pushed, you know, drawing a connection between what we're doing here and funding the Mount Daniel bond, because it, as far as I can tell, is the most shovel-ready capital project that we've got. There's broad community interest and benefit in it. It's ready to go. People will see an immediate impact of our going in that direction. And it has, you know, very long-lasting value. I mean, given as long as we keep our schools open here, you know, the expanded Mount Daniel could be here 70 years from now. And the water system, I think we owned for about 70 or 75 years. So all that would lead me, I think, to support language that would give us the flexibility that Mr. Baruch spoke to. It would, I think, lead me to the option at line 59, and it would lead me to go ahead and do first reading tonight, because while it's always important to get more public education and awareness and input, we have been discussing this topic very intensively for almost a year now. I remember sitting here in December of last having a very extensive discussion about this, and I get ready to vote on something when I'm hearing people talk and offer their opinions, and I'm not hearing anything new, something unexpected. All the things that I'm hearing now are things, they're legitimate concerns, but I've sort of factored them into my risk and reward calculus, and that leads me to be ready to vote on this on the calendar that's been laid out by staff.
Any other comments? Do we have a motion then? Ms. McCroskey?
Mr. Mayor, if and City Council, I can suggest perhaps the language that I've come up with here, which falls in line 34, which is the chart that's on page 4 of 7 in the board item, or in the City Council's item. And what I would do, the issue here is this is where the numbers are that reflect the amount in the pension fund. It's within the chart, it's lines 19 and 20. And line 20, if you see there's the additional pension contribution, I suggest that you strike the $10 million and that line read, the amount required to fully fund the pension fund up to $10 million. And I asked Mr. LeContre if that would be enough, and he said he believed that the 10 million would be sufficient. And then line 19, we would strike the 10,500,000 because that relates to the 10 million below, and that line would read 20,500,000 minus the amount finally determined for line 20. So that would be the remainder of the money, would be the reserve for capital costs.
I'm good with the Excel spreadsheet formula. I think that gets us there. Thank you. So,
Did we move or?
Wait, can I,
It's kind of like, yes.
we just need to figure, whoops. Line 59 and 67, which one of those section 2s are we?
I think we need to make a conforming change to whether we go with the original or alternative 2, because those have set amounts in there.
I'm sorry, where?
They're talking about the optional language now. I think that perhaps what you could do is, in the optional language, just reference the lines of the main ordinance that now have those more complicated wording in them. But instead of saying in the amount of 10,500,000, the amount
Indicated
in line.
line
If
20.
I can just make a process suggestion, just so we don't foul this up. If we can, since I may be the one moving on this, I'm fine with the line item as the city attorney has sort of put it forward as far as the language goes. Mayor Tartar, you raised and Ms. Conley as well, and I believe Ms. Oliver as well, the two choices between essentially what we do, whether we want to give ourselves flexibility to add or utilize 1 million on urgent capital or some figure more. Is there a way, again, it's hard to come up with that number not knowing what the needs are in the capital upcoming. Is there a way of giving ourselves discretion to utilize part of that, say roughly 10 million for urgent CIP issues now, or, we may want to put a cap on it. I'm sort of toying with it. I'm fine with, leaving it $1 million because we can always make adjustments to it. I don't think we're necessarily bound to not changing that number come the next fiscal year. Ms. LeCondre looks like he's going to reach out and say something. So we may already have that flexibility, even if we leave it at $1 million, to, say we want to change that to 2 moving forward. Or Mayor Tartar's indicating to me 1.5 million. What's our ability if we pick, say, 1 million or 1.5 to then, during the budget cycle, say, no, we've actually identified 1.75 million that we want to do?
I think if you go beyond that, you'd have to go back and amend this ordinance to do it. I think that would be the proper way to do it.
I see.
Which is why we would recommend that you not tie yourselves up with this additional language unless you really, really want to be bound by it, because...
So your recommendation, Mr. Shields, to do what?
My recommendation is that we're going to launch into capital planning, right now, and the council will make all of these decisions by ordinance in the very near future. And so That's when the council will be able to speak on this. This is a statement of intent that if, once we've gone through the CIP planning process, we come to some different calculations with all of the information, with all of our stakeholders' inputs.
I'm sorry.
We'll have to come back
So
and
your
undo this.
recommendation is don't put, so there's an alternative 3, which is don't have any language.
And that's the way it's actually drafted right now. So these are only in the staff report for your consideration, with the understanding of some of the difficulties that they could cause if they're adopted.
Again, I'm fine with not having the language in there, but I'm also hoping that staff does not bring forward a multi-million-dollar must-have CIP. I don't want to go through the drill that we went through with the last ordinance. So as long as there's an understanding that not everything is going to be a priority, and we're in the $1 to $2 million range, if it's clearly needed, I'm happy to have this discussion, but I do not want a free-for-all for some amount of undefined money that everybody is saying is urgent.
May I ask a question? You mean, Mr. Brigg, you would want the determination about the expenditure of these monies to be determined through the regular budget and CIP process?
I guess what I'm getting at is sort of having either of these options on the table clearly indicates parameters of, whether we say it has to have a useful life of 20 million, that sort of takes off things that are less than 20 years for immediate items. Or if we give ourselves flexibility, we could say, there's a cap of 1 million, 1.5 million, or 2 million. What Mr. Shields is proposing is that we wouldn't tie our hands at all in any way with a cap, so it'd be up to us during the budget process to figure out what those urgent, well-worth projects doing. And all I'm saying is I don't want a repeat of, well, everything's a priority and all of a sudden we're spending 10 million on the whole thing.
I understand.
So sort of like having an internal governor of a dollar amount that sort of forces us to be more disciplined. So I tend to lean that way, whether it's 1 million or 1.5 or up to $1.5 million. I'm good with that, but as I'm sort of focusing in on this, I'd rather have a cap at this point.
But if I may ask the staff, as offered to us without reference to anything on line 59 or line 67, if we were to approve this without any of that language included, the council would have the responsibility of determining in the current budget cycle, in the next budget and CIP cycle, and in all subsequent budget and CIP cycles, what portion of the proceeds to use for any purpose. Is that right? Or would it be limited to capital purposes?
Well, if we take the amendment that was just offered by the city attorney, and we take the language at line 67, and if you strike the words on line 68 after the word reserves, and just strike the words in the amount of $10,500,000, so that it reads, be it further ordained that with a commitment of capital reserves as set forth in this ordinance, at least $9,500,000 will be allocated in the CIP only for capital projects will have a useful life of 20 years, and up to $1 million to be used for more immediate capital needs. What that does then is that $9.5 million can grow if the UAL decreases. So say it's $9.2 million, then that takes $800,000, and that would grow that $9.5 million to $10.3 million. The $1 million, however, is capped. That's how I would interpret that language if it's adopted that way.
Okay, that's helpful. The $1 million language, as I read it, says up to $1 million may be used. It doesn't say that it must be used. Is that true?
Correct.
I'm emphasizing the word may, trying to respond to the concern that, the day that we pass this, we don't want to start the next day figuring out, oh my golly, how are we going to spend $1 million? I mean, there's certainly, I agree with the mayor, things that need to be done, but I also acknowledge that, you know, there's staff limitations, and we are getting pretty close to doing the actual budget and CIP. So as a practical matter, you know, we're going to be talking about these things in the regular order pretty soon. So I'm happy with what you just said, with the emphasis on the up to $1 million may be used. We're not like requiring ourselves to use it, in other words.
Okay, other comments, Ms. Oliver? Why don't we try to wrap this up coming up here?
Sorry, I think that Section 2 and Alternative 2 are trying to get at the fact that people wanted to make sure that we were not frittering the funds away, that we were investing in the future of the city. And so the language that says shall only be used for capital projects with a useful life of at least 20 years is trying to get at that long-term investment. However, there is some interest in not completely tying our hands, so that's the only thing that we can do. And it seems to me that the way to perhaps redo this would be to say that the commitment to capital reserves, that up to, say, 85% of it must be committed to the long-term use. And then that still gives you, up to 85% must be committed to long-term use. That protects the interest of keeping most of these funds going towards that long-term investment, but still gives you some flexibility to make the short-term improvements that seem like they might be good opportunities.
I think from drafting, it probably ought to say at least 85% as opposed to up to 85%. But, so anyway, do we have either motion to put forth on the floor or any further comments? We can try to wrap this up. Mr. Duncan, did you have something to say?
Do you want to make the motion here? Okay.
Okay, fine. Yes, I will make a motion, although I will have to rely heavily on the public record as recorded by the clerk, who articulated the city attorney's language meticulously, I'm sure. Mr. Mayor, I move to grant first reading of ordinance TO 14-30 and to schedule a public hearing and second reading for October 27th, 2014. With the motion incorporating the language suggested by the city attorney and with the additional provision that the phrase at least 85% shall be allocated in the capital improvements program for only for capital projects that will have a useful life of at least 20 years. Further, and up to $1 million may be used for more immediate capital needs with no further restrictions.
If I could just comment, I think that's inconsistent, actually.
Be 85-15.
I think at
You wanted to say 85-15?
I don't think we need to put a number on the immediate capital needs. It's just something less than 15%.
Or just the remainder.
Ah, okay. I see what
So
you're saying.
just stop it put a period after 20 years.
No, I think I think you were suggesting you wanted to say, and the remainder may be used for more immediate capital needs.
Oh, okay.
But that's a, Phil,
Yes,
Mr. Duncan?
I appreciate the clarification, Ryan. I'm trying to mix apples and oranges there. 85 and the remainder should be.
Madam-
Is that clear, Ms. Clerk? I mean, not at all, not even vaguely.
Why don't we try again?
Do you want to hear what I have
Yeah,
on the Section 2?
please.
Okay, so you're adding this commitment to capital reserves as set forth in this ordinance At least 85% of these funds shall be allocated in the capital improvements program only for capital projects that will have a useful life of at least 20 years, and the remainder may be used for immediate capital needs with no further restrictions.
Nodding. That's the intent of the mover.
Okay, do we have a second?
I'll second.
Ms. Oliver on the second. You're looking,
I'm fine.
people are looking back and forth here. Okay.
I'll nod.
I'm sorry,
Go ahead.
can we have one more read? I just want to make sure that this is clear.
So we had a motion to grant first reading, correct? To TO 1430, incorporating the language suggested by the city attorney with the additional provision that with the commitment to capital reserves as set forth in this ordinance, at least 85% of these funds shall be allocated in the capital improvements program only for capital projects that will have a useful life of at least 20 years, and the remainder may be used for more immediate capital needs with no further restrictions.
Correct. And 85% would be roughly 2 million and change? Am I doing that math right?
85% would be approximately
I'm sorry.
$8.3 million, something like
Okay,
that.
so that leaves about,
Oh, no, I'm sorry, out of 10.5, I'm sorry, I was doing the other. That would be probably
how much
about,
is left?
about 8.7 million, something like that.
So that leaves 1 million and change roughly, almost 2 million.
I think more like 1.5. Okay, do we have a second on the motion?
Yeah, I'll second it. That gets to the intent and provides sort of the governor, if you will, of 15% can't, not over 15% can be used, so.
We already had a second.
Right, so.
Oh, sorry.
Wait, who's second? I'm
Ms.
sorry,
Oliver.
My apologies, Ms. Oliver.
Can we have 3 seconds on that? Yeah.
Okay, so,
It's rare I can get 3 people to agree with me. Let's go with those double seconds.
all right, unless there's anything else,
I have two things. Can I
okay, Ms. Conley?
On line 75, fiscal impact, works, line 77 rather, the long-term average return on investment of 7.5%, but that may change to be 7%, right? The long-term average. And if we put in less than, it may not change to be 7%. I've heard both numbers over time, that we're getting a 7% or 7.5%.
Yeah, our historical average has been 7.5%, but we are, for modeling purposes, should be using 7%. And so that part of the fiscal impact really should be 7% annual return or $700,000.
Okay, so that should be 7%. And if we invest less than $10.5 million in the pension fund, then the return will then be 7% of 9 million or 7% less, right? So the return could be as low as
Zero.
zero.
It could be zero.
630. So the return could be as low as 630. And is that a reasonable return on $9 million?
All right,
Okay.
last comment.
So
from
here,
Mr.
I have one more question.
Okay.
If I abstain, like Mr. Snyder, what are the consequences of abstaining? Just
Well, the
asking.
motion may or may not pass. It
Motion may or
depends
may
on
not
the-
pass.
Because we don't have enough, there would not be enough supporters of the motion
Okay.
for it to
I just
pass.
feel like, Mr. Snyder, that this was our public hearing, and we didn't hear much from the public, and it just is a lot of money, and we're fiddling around trying to get it right, and it just makes me nervous. And I know we would like to have this tied to a vote on the Mount Daniel referendum. It just makes me nervous to commit at this point.
Mr. Duncan?
Yeah, if I could follow on that comment. I mean, sure, I understand, everybody understands that this is a really big decision. And we would all love to have more, public awareness and input. The attendance at the Watertown Hall on Saturday was not poor, but it was not heavily attended by people who we don't usually see. actually, the attendance itself was not too bad, but there weren't a whole lot of new folks looking for an opportunity to learn. So pursuant to that, if this were able to advance tonight, I would just have it be the legislative intent that staff go every extra mile to publicize council's action tonight, certainly to pull together any information that we will need well in advance of second reading, and use whatever vehicles you have at your disposal to make the community aware that we have grappled with this for a long time, and we have come to a proposal that we are advancing as, the choice we are going to make, indicating that they should speak now or forever hold their peace.
Thank you. Madam Clerk, will you call a roll call vote?
Mr. Baruch?
Yes.
Ms. Conley?
Abstain.
Mr. Duncan?
Yes.
Ms. Oliver?
Yes.
Mr. Snyder?
Abstain.
Mr. Z?
Abstain.
Mayor Tarter?
Yes.
And the motion carries. 4 yeses, 3 abstentions.
Okay, well, let's move on to the next item. Looks like that is consent items. Is there any discussion needs to be had about these items?
Just the one item, the contract approval is the authorization to amend a contract with McMillan, Patterson Smith Architecture for services to expend up to $30,000, subject to appropriation of funds by City Council. And this is to do the additional space planning and parking analysis for the library.
And I'm sure I missed this, but did we allocate $47,000 through our last process for this? But we're only authorizing 30 of it to be spent?
I believe that through prior change orders of a smaller amount, we're getting to the full expenditure for
Okay.
other smaller changes to the contract.
All right, do we have a motion for the consent items?
Mr. Mayor, I move approval of consent items.
Do we have a second?
I'll second.
All in favor? Say
Aye.
Opposed? Abstentions? The ayes have it. Okay, business not on the agenda. Is there any business not on the agenda to discuss tonight? Any council member comments? Okay, let's go on to approval of the minutes of previous meetings. Are there any corrections to the minutes of August 11th or September 8th? Any corrections to those minutes? Okay, do we have a motion to approve the minutes? Do we have a motion?
I make a motion to approve the minutes from August 11th and September 8th.
Do we have a second?
Second.
All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Abstentions? The ayes have it. Anything else for tonight's meeting?
Could I just ask a scheduling question? There had been some discussion of a special meeting with the Arlington County Board later this month. Is that a date that's still on?
It is likely to be on. It's not been formally confirmed. It's likely to be October 28th.
Okay.
Anything else for tonight's meeting, Mr. Baruch?
Just a reminder for EDC members, I think the plan is to have a EDC meeting, and this is subject to a future scheduling change, to have a meeting Monday before the council meeting. I believe the start time would be at 6:30. Is that right, Mr. Shields? To talk through voluntary proffers and sort of the status of the Mason Row project, and then also if we can add to the agenda item, trying to find a regular meeting time. Perhaps Sandy or our new city clerk can find some nifty electronic way of polling council members so we can provide, or I'm sorry, EDC members of available time so we can try to nail that piece down.
Okay, is there anything else for tonight's meeting, or should we go ahead and adjourn?
Oh, sorry, a couple of other notes. Mr. Manager, have we gotten an update on the situation on North Oak Street? That had been the subject of correspondence over the summer.
I will provide the council with an update if I could after this meeting.
Okay. And also, just backtrack, we did not return to Mr. Z's question about the DMV Select situation. I just want to make sure that that stays on our radar screen and that staff level discussions continue toward a hopeful resolution of the situation there.
Okay, anything else, or should we go ahead and adjourn? All right, we are adjourned. Thank you. Mr. Baruch, one last thing.
I move that we
Okay, we
adjourn.
move to adjourn. We have a second. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Ayes have it.